Well, thank you very much, Claire, and thank you for all you do. We're all incredibly grateful. Right, well, let's move on to the main event of today, MPF 4, and we're delighted to have John Mayhew with us. John is the director of the Association for the Protection of Rural Scotland, APRS, and he's a planner and he's been working in planning policy for more years than he cares to remember, probably. So I shall pass over to John and we'll hear about MPF 4. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Could somebody just confirm that I can be heard okay?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you. Right. Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk to your annual gathering. For those of you who don't know me, this is who I am. Started out as a geographer. Over the years, I became a town and country planner. Most of my career was at the National Trust for Scotland. Those dates are on the screen. I ended up as head of policy and planning at NTS. NTS made me redundant in 2007, not because I'd done anything wrong as far as I know, but just because NTS ran out of money and it made a whole stack of people redundant, which it does from time to time. I had a really lucky break. I was invited to become the director of the Association for Protection of Rural Scotland from 2008, and I've been there ever since, and that's an extremely interesting role. But also, I'm a cyclist, I'm a hill walker, I'm a skier, I'm somebody who enjoys the outdoors. I love Scotland, I love rural Scotland, and that's really what drives me, I think probably like many of you as well. So I'm here to talk about the fourth National Planning Framework, the draft fourth National Planning Framework, which has this rather snappy headline, Scotland 2045. And I'll admit this is aimed at a reasonably introductory or medium level. I've had a quick look at who's attending, and there are some fairly weighty planning experts here who know more about this than I do. But this isn't mainly for you, so it's impossible to do a presentation which is for beginners and for experts, but I've headed it more towards the introductory kind of area. This document is out for consultation now from November until March, I think it is. Claire will correct us on that later on. We've got a bit of time, we haven't got too much time, and it's really important, and that's the thing that I want to get across to now. It's important for anybody who's interested in planning, as I'm sure all of you are. It's really important for anybody who's interested in any aspect of Scotland, because this is basically the National Plan for Scotland, the National Spatial Plan for Scotland. It's not just words, it's maps. It says what's going to happen, what isn't going to happen, it says where it's going to happen as well. We've got a big opportunity to influence this document. It's called Scotland 2045. I don't think it'll last until 2045. The previous one lasted about 8 years. This one may do as well. But the 2045 thing's crucial, because what it means is the Scottish Government are looking that far ahead, and that this document has that kind of perspective. And the reason for that date is that is the date when Scotland has to become net zero, it has to become carbon neutral. So the policies and the strategies which are in this document are meant to help us achieve that. That's yet another reason why it's really important. Next thing I want to say is, don't be don't be put off by NPF 4. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. It's not a problem, it's not a challenge, it's an opportunity. Let's engage with it, let's make it a good thing, and let's make it better. I'm old enough to remember previous versions of the National Planning Framework. So it is NPF 4. Up on the screen is NPF 2, which was from about 2009, I think, and the current NPF, Ambition Opportunity Place, is NPF 3, and that was approved in 2013. I couldn't find on my shelves or my electronic shelves a copy of NPF 1, but I can assure you that it did exist. So this has been around for a while. It came in the 2006 Planning Act, and it's an improvement on what we had before, because we didn't have a national plan before. We had a whole bunch of local plans and a whole bunch of regional plans, and I don't think they hung together better. So whatever its shortcomings, it's a good thing. Now, why is it important? It's important because it's the long-term strategic spatial plan for Scotland. There's a lot of words there. It's long-term, therefore it's important. It's strategic, that means it's big scale, it tackles the big issues. It's spatial, that means it's about places, not just about words. It is a plan, and it is for the whole of Scotland. So in those few words explains why it's important. But it's even more important than NPF 3. because the 2019 Planning Act brought in a whole bunch of changes to the planning system, and it's squeezing together what used to be Scottish planning policy, which is basically words, with what used to be NPF3, which is basically maps. So it's bringing the maps and the words together, which I think is a good thing, because we used to have these two big national planning documents, and now we're only going to have one. Then there's a slightly more technical thing here. It is going to be part of the development plan. And what that means is it's part of the suite of documents which makes up the words which councils have to judge planning applications against. And that's encapsulated in this final rather dull bullet at the bottom. This matters because councils are legally required to make decisions on planning applications in line with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And any of you who have ever been involved with planning will have had that drilled into you and will probably be able to recite it as you count sheep and go off to sleep. It's the single most important thing about any planning application. So if you're here tonight because you have tried to tackle what you consider to be a bad planning application, ultimately what's driving that comes back to NPF4. If NPF4 isn't right, the local development plans aren't right, and if the local development plans aren't right, then the wrong applications come forward and the wrong applications are approved. And that's because of this business. And I'm going to read it again because it really is so important. Councils are required by law to make decisions on planning applications in line with the development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So the NPF4 sits up there at the top of the development plan, and that's why it's important. Now, this is a bit simplistic, but this is what I've got in my head as to the changes which the 29 Planning Act made, technically the Planning Scotland Act 2019. So before we had NPF3, we had Scottish planning policy, so we had these two big documents. We had strategic development plans for the city regions, so for the Aberdeen and surrounding areas, Dundee area, Glasgow area, Edinburgh area. So we had strategic development plans covering large swathes of Scotland, but not all of it. So there were big chunks of what my organisation cares about, rural Scotland, which weren't covered by strategic development plans. The Highlands, Argyll and Bute, Dumfries and Galloway, the borders, most of rural Scotland wasn't covered by it. And then we had the local development plans, which are probably the thing you most come across in your local efforts to promote good applications and defeat bad ones. After the Planning Act, we will have the purpose of planning, and I'm coming on to that. We'll have NPF4, which we're talking about tonight, but we'll still have local development plans. Now, before and after, what I really mean is now and shortly in the future, because the Planning Act 2019 didn't all come into play the day it was approved. It's gradually coming into play. So the purpose of planning is in play. We still have NPF3, Scottish planning policy, and the SDPs are still in force until they're replaced by NPF4. So we're in a kind of transition at the moment between the before and after, but I hope that explains why, not just why it's important, but where it fits into the big changes that are going on. Now we've got this new thing, and several of our organisations pushed for this to go into the Planning Act, because the Planning Act was a great opportunity to say, what are we actually trying to do here? This planning that we all got so worked up about, what is it actually for? And there was a lot of resistance from the Scottish government to actually putting in words what the point of it all is. But we made them, we meaning the NGOs and we meaning several MSPs, particularly in opposition parties, we forced the government really to put this phrase in, and it actually explains the purpose of planning is to manage the development and use of land in the long-term public interest. Now, we've never had that before, so now we actually know what we're trying to do here. We know what the purpose of the whole exercise is. The Act also says that if you want to know what the long-term public interest is, you've probably got your own views, I certainly have, but if you want to know what the law thinks, you look at two things: sustainable development and Scotland's national outcomes. Now, sustainable development is an international concept which applies across the globe. It's had many words written about it, and there are international sustainable development goals. They're things like clean water, education for everybody, ending poverty, decent housing for everyone, tackling climate change, looking after our soils. They're all good, big international goals. And then the other ones are how those are translated into Scotland, and that's called Scotland's national outcomes. You can look all these things up. So The Sustainable Development Goals are on the Sustainable Development Commission website. Scotland's national outcomes are on the Scottish Government website. So anything which contributes to those is considered as being in the long-term public interest. And this sits above NPF 4. Now, the Act also gave NPF 4 6 outcomes, which, again, this is a new thing. The government could basically put in NPF 3 whatever they thought they could get away with, whereas now NPF 4 has to achieve, by law, has to achieve these 6 things. And these are all pretty incontroversial, aren't they? Health and well-being, housing, equality, eliminating discrimination. And then the big new ones, I'm quite pleased to see this, you know, it's statutory outcome that the NPF 4 has to help meet targets for greenhouse gas emissions, and it has to secure positive effects for biodiversity. So the things which us environmental NGOs campaign for, which is basically promoting biodiversity and tackling climate change, these are now written into the law for the first time. Now, the one there which I find a little bit unusual, and we could maybe discuss this later, is increasing the population of rural areas. It doesn't actually say why. It doesn't say increasing the population of urban areas or increasing the population of Scotland. It's got a real focus on increasing the population of rural areas, but it doesn't explain why. And the reason why is because MSPs introduced amendments into the Planning Act to make sure that that was a statutory outcome for NPF 4, because they believe strongly that Scotland's rural areas should have more people. I think this probably, it harks back to the clearances. There is a very long memory in some part of Scotland as to how there used to be more people than there are now, and that's a bad thing, and those people should come back, or their percent should come back. I think it also relates to ongoing rural depopulation. There are places in the Western Isles, there are places in Argyll and Bute that are still losing their people, particularly losing their young people, and that is affecting the ability to provide services such as schools and post offices and shops and public transport and so on. So I think that's what lies behind that one, but that might be something we can discuss afterwards. Right, so that's all the kind of background and context. Hope you found that useful. Now on to the actual thing. So the structure of NPF 4, it's got 4 sections, strategy and national developments, and these come from NPF 3. So NPF 3 had a strategy and it had national developments, but then NPF 4 has the policies, which used to be Scottish planning policy. So this is how they're being merged. There's the bits which we previously had in the national planning framework first, then we've got the policies, which are the bits that used to be, well, still are in Scottish planning policies. And then at the end of it, there's a delivery mechanism. I'm going to focus this evening mostly on strategy and national developments, and then the breakout section is going to focus mostly on the policies. Now, we're moving away from the law and into policy. So these 6 spatial principles which NPF 4 sets for itself, they are still draft, so they could be changed. The law can't be changed, but not at the moment anyway, but NPF 4 could be. So they say the things which should drive every decision with NPF 4 are compact growth, local living, balanced development, conserving and recycling assets, urban and rural synergy, and just transition. And by just transition, they mean predominantly away from industries which generate climate change to industries which don't. And I think these are, you could say these are motherhood and apple pie. You could also say they're fine principles. They're not really things many people could argue with. But when you look through what NPF is proposing, a lot of it links back to these 6 spatial principles. So it's worth having a think about whether those are the right things that are driving it. Now, this isn't from the NPF 4. That previous one was a quote from the NPF 4. This is my list of some of the things that NPF 4 tackles. And if you haven't got my message that I'm drilling home yet, that this is really important, then just have a look at this list. The things we in the NGO movement care about the most, the climate emergency and nature crisis, but once you start looking at those, you have to start caring about transport, housing, energy, the circular economy, the idea that we don't make things and throw them away, that we make things and we recycle them and we reuse them and we use them again. That is a really crucial part of sustainable development. It covers retail, shopping, industry, business, how we look after our heritage, our historic heritage, our natural heritage. All of these things are in NPF 4. They're all tackled. Some of them are tackled well, some of them are tackled less well. But if you care about any of those things, you should care about NPF 4. Now, here's the absolute guts of it. This is the national strategy for Scotland. And this is the big diagram, which starts off the whole of NPF 4. It doesn't most of it doesn't actually tell you anything you didn't know. It tells you that there's a ferry going out of Aberdeen. It tells you that Scotland is a coastal country with islands. It tells you that it has a few cities. It tells you where the major ports were. You probably know where most of the major ports were. But just creeping into this, there's a few quite interesting things. Can you look at the yellow lines? Those yellow lines show that it's the Scottish Government's intention to build interconnectors, electrical interconnectors between the mainland and the Western Isles, Orkney, and the very big long one to Shetland. And the main reason for that is because those are places which could generate a lot of renewable energy, and they need to shift it to the places where it's going to be used. So those already are big infrastructure projects which are in the National Planning Framework, or they're going to be in the National Planning Framework. As so many of these things, they are a good thing because they're enabling renewable energy. They might also be a bad thing depending on what happens when they hit the land and what effects they have on the coastal environment and on the marine environment. So when you're looking at a map like this, you have to look at the things which you know about and think, yeah, there's lots of red lines and that shows there's a railway from Perth to Inverness. Well, I knew that. There's another red line showing there's a motorway from Glasgow to the English border. Yes, I knew that. And then you go, aha, there's a yellow line showing the interconnectors. So that's what that's about. It also has these themes, and these feed through the strategy, but also into the policies. So we have policies, which we're going to discuss later on, of sustainable, livable, productive and distinctive places. It's quite snappy, all of this, and it's a little bit forced because some of the policies could fit into more than one of those places. So it's just a way of dividing the whole thing up, so it isn't just a list. But these are, it's got these spatial principles, it's got these common themes, it's got the statutory outcomes. So all of this is sitting above the actual document. Now, another thing that it has is this spatial strategy. So this is the spatial strategy for the whole of MPF4. So moving from the overall strategy, which was the one I was talking about, the yellow and red lines, it then hones in onto these 5 separate areas. So north and west, north, northeast, southern, central, and they've thought up a kind of slogan which goes with each of them, such as North and West Coastal Innovation or Central Urban Transformation. And what they're doing here is they're saying that different parts of Scotland have different opportunities and different policies will apply to them. And if you leaf through the whole thing, you'll see how that actually plays out in all the detailed words. And I've chosen one of them, as Helen said, as an example, and that's the Central Urban Transformation. And I've only chosen that just to show how that national strategy then comes down to the regional level. And I've just chosen that one because that's where most of the people of Scotland live. It's probably where most of us live. So if you look on that slide, you'll see how the themes and the spatial strategies, which were for the whole of Scotland, how they translate to a particular area, in this case, central Scotland. So there's a little bit more detail included on there. And the other thing that's starting to come in now is the national developments. I'm moving on to this next, but if you look down the left-hand side, the under livable places, productive places, distinctive places, those themes coming back in again, those coloured dots, the coloured circles with numbers in them, those are the national developments. And what they're doing here is showing the national developments which apply to this area, the Central Urban Transformation area. So some of them apply only to that area, and those are the ones in bold. So just to take the first few examples, the Central Scotland Green Network, the Urban Mass Rapid Transit Networks, the Urban Sustainable Blue and Green Drainage Solutions, those only apply to this area. And the ones which are faded out a little, like 2 and 5 and 6, the National Walking, Cycling, Wheeling Network, the Circular Economy, Material Management Facilities, etc., those apply to the whole of Scotland, including this bit we're particularly look at. So we're now seeing the strategy and the themes and the overall plan being translated into a particular part of Scotland. When you look at the document, you'll want to look at your bit of Scotland and see how that works for you. Now, these are the national developments. This is another thing that's been in the National Planning Framework for many years. And what these are specific developments which either happen in a particular location or they happen over a widespread part of Scotland, which are considered particularly significant and particularly large scale and sufficiently worthy to be put into the National Planning Framework. And the Planning Act back in 2006 divided planning applications into local, major and national. So local would be me trying to build a porch on the back of my house. Major would be a housing developer wanting to build 200 houses in the field next to you. And anything national has to be in this list. So there are only 18 of them proposed in the National Planning Framework. These can be changed, particularly if enough people want to get rid of one of these and can persuade MSPs to vote it out. That can happen. If there's anything particularly important you want to see added in, that can happen too. So although I think it's highly likely that these 18 will see it through to the final cut, that's not absolutely inevitable. And the point I wanted to make about these national developments is that they're including them in the National Planning Framework establishes their need. So that when the application comes forward, which goes to the local authority in the normal way, the local authority can't question the need for them because that's already been established by Parliament through its approval of the National Planning Framework. Still needs to go through the planning process because there's loads of details to be discussed about it, but that gives them a head start over any other major development. And they can be good things. Again, please don't think that this is a problem, it's an issue. These include things like the Central Scotland Green Network and the National Walking, Cycling and Wheeling Network, which in my organisation's opinion are both thoroughly good things, which we should celebrate. There are other things here which are good. There are others which kind of depend on what's proposed. So, for example, there are some pretty major individual sites here, such as Hunterston or Chapel Cross, which will be redeveloped during the life of this National Planning Framework. And whether they end up being a good thing for Scotland depends on the detail of what's actually proposed. Now, so that's another part of it. We've had the main strategy, we've had the national developments, and now we're coming into what used to be Scottish planning policy, but is now the policies section of the National Planning Framework. Now, I don't have time to go through all of these, but just look at that list and look at the ones that interest you, and those are the ones which you will wish to comment on either individually or with your organisations. So if you're interested in culture and creativity, there are policies on that. If you're interested in human rights, there are policies on that. If you're interested in rural Scotland, if you're interested in urban Scotland, if you're interested in fish farming, if you're interested in IT, there are policies on all of these things in the National Planning Framework. Have I got the point across yet that it's important and wide-ranging and applies to an awful lot of things? All I'm going to do is just pick one thing, no, two things. One that I know a little bit about, which is green belts, and one which is a particular interest to planning democracy. So here is a sample policy just to show you the sort of thing which is in, and this is the one about urban edges and the green belt. And it says what the overall plan is: increase density of our settlements, restore nature and promote local living. And then it actually has some positive words about greenbelts. It can be used as a tool to help direct growth to the most appropriate sustainable locations. The idea being, if you have a greenbelt around a town, that discourages development in there and it encourages development within the town. And then it goes on to the statutory bit, so that this has been around for a long while: protecting and enhancing the character, landscape and setting and identity of settlements. All good things. But then it starts to add new things in, because these weren't in before. And they're good things: providing outdoor access to green networks which link urban and rural areas, and supporting nature networks. Now, some of that wording is in there because we pushed for it to be in there, and that is pleasing to me, that the effort we've made at earlier stages of this is just starting to show through. So the greenbelt policies in the draft NPF4 are better than the greenbelt policies in any of the previous NPFs. So we're pleased about that, and we want to keep them there. So our battle with this will be to back the Scottish Government and say those are good policies, keep them, because there will be other people, there will be other organisations in Scotland that don't like those because it will limit their development aspirations, and they will be arguing very strongly to weaken those policies. In other cases, we will think that the policies are weak and we want to strengthen them, and we will be fighting against other people who want to weaken them. So what we do, whether we back the policy, say it should be stronger, will depend on the actual wording which has been used. Here's another bit about greenbelts, and this again is good, because the previous National Planning Framework said something like, you don't really have to have greenbelts, but if you must have them, there are some places where I suppose they can be vaguely useful. I'm being flippant, but it was quite a negative, grudging wording for green belts, whereas now it says local development plans should consider using green belts where appropriate, where there is significant danger of unsustainable growth in car-based commuting. Now that's all new as well. In such circumstances, green belts can benefit quality of life, minimize the need to travel. So these are good things, these are good policies, and it is being improved. One other example, quality homes. So often the developments which we are concerned about are housing developments, or as the housing developers would call them, quality home developments. And there's lots of good words here. Good quality homes, tackling climate change, energy efficient, let's see, net zero emissions, houses can support a greener, fairer, more inclusive economy. The planning system should support the delivery of more and better homes in the right locations, choice across tenure. So there's a lot of good stuff in there, but, and there's a big but, also in the National Planning Framework is this very large table with a very large number of proposed houses. Now, this is a new thing. This didn't used to be in the National Planning Framework, and this was inserted in while the Planning Act was going through. There were amendments which said that the National Planning Framework must include the full list of where all the houses are going to go. And the way this works is just to take the top of it, there's Aberdeen City, 7,000, Aberdeenshire, 7,500, added up to the Aberdeen City region, 14,500. And then there's the Dundee City region, then the Edinburgh City region, and so on. And once you've been through the 4 city regions, down at the bottom, you then see 2,150 houses allocated for Argyll and Bute. And if we go over the page, we get to 9,500 houses in the Highlands and 3,450 houses in Murray. So as well as all those fine words about housing in the National Planning Framework, there really are a lot of numbers there. And I'm wondering what's the rationale behind those numbers? What's the process by which those numbers have been arisen? What's the process by which those numbers will be translated down through local development plans? This is the work which Nick has been doing for planning democracy, and which Claire was talking about earlier on. So simply having those numbers, those really quite big numbers in the National Planning Framework, is not the end of the story. There are further parts to this story which will appear later on. So now is the time to debate that. Now is the time to debate green belts and also housing policies. And when in our breakout groups, which are starting in 5 or 10 minutes, when we're debating the individual policies, these are some of the things that you might wish to bear in mind. Now, I think Claire is going to talk a little bit more about this, but this is my final slide, and it's just to say, this is how you do your consultation responses. So this was launched on the 10th of November. We're less than a month into it. And there is, for once in Scottish public life, there is a proper consultation period. And do you know why there is a proper consultation period? It's because we fought for it. We, the NGO movement, said it wasn't long enough and it needed to be, I think this is 120 days, which actually gives communities enough time to look at it and discuss it and to lobby their MSPs. There are 2 consultations going on. There's a public consultation going on and there's a parliamentary consultation going on. So the Scottish Government wants to hear from you, but the Scottish Parliament also wants to hear from you. By all means, respond directly to the Scottish Government. And there's a link below. The Transforming Planning Scotland website is where all of this can be found. But also, if you're responding to the Scottish Government, which are the officials, also send your response to your 8 MSPs. Remember, you have 1 constituency MSP and 7 regional or list MSPs. And if you want to know who they are, then look them up on the Scottish Parliament website or ask anybody at Planning Democracy and they'll be able to help you. Within the Scottish Parliament, the local government committee will be leading the process of analysing the responses coming in, but it will also be inviting other committees to contribute. This is going to be a complicated exercise, and again, it's because NPF affects so many aspects of Scottish public life. There will be many parliamentary committees feeding into the local government committee. APRS and Planning Democracy will help you if we can. We will, over the next month or 2, be preparing our main asks, our main the main things we think are good and we want to keep, and the main things we think are not good enough and we want to improve, and we will be making those available to you. Other organisations no doubt will be doing the same thing, so there will be help for you. I would encourage you to respond. You can either do so through the transformingplanning.scot website, or the direct email address of the planners in the Scottish Government is scotplan@gov.scot. So if you would like just to send an email with a few key points in it, send it there. So that's all I've got to say. It's up to, I think, Helen, who's chairing this bit, whether there's time for questions or not. If there are, I'm happy to answer them. If there isn't, then Planning Democracy can put any of you in touch with me at any point and I will try to answer them. Thank you very much for listening and I hope you found that useful.
Well, thank you very much, John. It was very useful indeed. I've got a few questions in the chat. Can I just read out a question? William Maxwell, he's wondering, are councils likely to be pushing through unpopular planning applications before NPF4 comes into effect?
Yes, that's my suspicion. I think it's
Yeah.
it's already been happening and it's highly likely to happen. There's another thing which I didn't go into detail, and that is that a year ago the Scottish Government tried to change Scottish planning policy. I think many people in Planning Democracy will know about this, in order to stop housing developments going ahead purely because the local authority had run out of housing land and not because it was actually a good development in the right place. They failed in that because the housing developers took a legal challenge, and so SPP, which was temporarily improved, has now gone back to what it was before, and there is signs that housing developers are putting in applications now because they think they've got a better chance of getting them through than when NPF4 has gone through. That's not a scientific survey, that is my assessment, having watched what's going on across Scotland.
Thanks. There are a couple of questions in the chat, but I know we're a bit short of time, but I see Jackie put quite a few points in the chat. Thank you very much for that. I guess the question probably is, will NPF4 make any difference to all of this, John? What do you think?
It could do. Those local battles are going to continue, Jackie, I'm sure they are. But the wording in the Planning Act matters, the wording in NPF matters, because those are the things which influence the wording of the local development plan, which then is what the planners are obliged to assess the sort of applications that you're tackling against. They don't always get it right. I share your despair at what is happening in some places, but we have to be positive. We have to try to make NPF4 as good as it can be, because there is the chance that it will help to improve things in the future. We may not succeed, but if we don't try, then those who seek to weaken it will prevail. So I would urge you to be positive if you possibly can, and to try to improve it, because it will help people like Jackie and people like her in the future who are trying to tackle individual planning applications.
I can see there are other questions, but I think in terms of time, we're going to have to move on, John. Thank you so much. I just wanted to pass over to Claire, because Claire just has a few words to wrap up this section. So over to you, Claire.
Lovely. I just wanted to, I think it's the, yeah, no, that.
Oh dear.
I know Claire's having connection issues.
Yes. Well, I guess while she's not there, we can see what she was going to say. That the deadline is the 31st of March 2022. Better get used to that new year. And there are, I know that the government is putting on a whole range of community events. John may know more about this than I do. And I think that if you want to register interest in that would be the email address to contact there. Okay, so that would be the website where you can get involved to look at the consultation and the resources that are available for community groups to get involved. I'm afraid Claire's more of an expert on this one. Okay, so this is the community engagement work that the government is really keen that community organisations do hold events to talk about how they can get involved in the NPF4 process, and there are grants available. So if you're in a community council or other community body and you'd like to hold an event, do think about that, because you can get £250 towards it, which is, well, I suppose it's our money in the end of the day, isn't it? But still it's nice to get it. And various online events, and I think that will be the government events, but also, as we've said previously, Planning Democracy is obviously hoping to hold some events as well. Oh,
Helen, I'm back if you
oh,
want to.
there you are. Brilliant. Okay, over to you.
I'm so sorry. I think it's the weather. I think it's the weather keeps cutting me off. But I just wanted to point out also that the deadline, have you pointed out that the deadline for the parliamentary consultation is different from the Scottish Government consultation. So as John has already pointed out, there's two concurrent consultation processes. There's the Scottish National, the Scottish Government one, which the deadline is the 31st of March, and that's the one that we're going to look at in the event in the breakout rooms just coming up. But if you move it on, Kelly, and that's where you can find out the information. And then if you move it on, Kelly, next one, these are the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee are asking different questions. Go back one, please. And they're asking questions around a little bit easier questions, but you might want to think how who you want to address your consultation response to, whether you want to talk to the government or whether you want to try and persuade your MSP or the Local Government and Housing Planning Committee to influence the document. So you've got two ways in there, but the deadline for the committee scrutinising the document, the deadline there is the 10th of January. Just very quickly moving on, because I know we're running out of time. We will be doing workshops, future workshops, to be answering some of the questions that you've been asking about, housing and things like that. How can we influence this national planning framework in order to, overcome some of the issues that we've got around unsustainable housing on green belt and so on. We'll be covering that sort of thing in January, February. Big document. We're reluctant to sort of send too much information before we've really sort of thought about it well, and we'll also be doing information sharing environment link organisations. We are a member of Scottish Environment Link, and there's other organisations like the Woodland Trust and the RSPB who've been looking and very involved and keen to do events on this national planning framework in January, February as well. Next slide, please, Kelly. Just I wanted to quickly point out some of the things that we could look at, the overarching issues that you might want to think about this MPF4. Is it as transformational as they say it's going to be? How close is it to what we've got, the status quo? Is it really, it's still, in my opinion, very much about enabling development rather than protecting against inappropriate and unsustainable development. So maybe you want to think about that. Maybe look at some of the contradictions that are within the document itself. They're talking about dualling the A96 at the same time as talking about 20-minute neighbourhoods. Are those consistent policies? Weighting of policies, which ones are going to take priority? Is it still going to be the economic development ones that get the priority over the biodiversity ones, for example? Do we need to strengthen those and ask them to strengthen them in our consultation responses? As John was alluding to, what is and isn't in the public interest? This term development in the public interest, nobody has really defined exactly what that means. I mean, it is part of the national outcomes and sustainable development goals, but that's quite a sort of broad description of what actually is in the public interest. So that's do they need to tighten that up a little bit more? Are they talking about limits? Are they talking about limiting growth, limiting development at all in this document? Should they be? We've got to think about this nowadays. Maybe we need to be thinking about having presumptions against development put in, policies around presumptions against development that are not in the public interest or not in the plan. Also, I wanted to point out section 4. is about delivery. So after all of the sections that John's described, there's one on delivery, and I think that's really important, because it's all very well having these policies, but actually it's how things are delivered is what's important. And public-led planning and local place plans might be a way of delivering community-led planning, and maybe we need to be strengthening some of these policies around community-led planning, so that there's maybe a presumption in favour of community-led planning. And finally, mitigation against flooding. They've got a lot of things about mitigation in this plan, but one of the things I noticed they don't have is, how do we mitigate against biodiversity loss? We don't really sort of talk about the impacts of the loss of bumblebees or insects on our food production, for instance, whereas we have a lot around, how impacts of climate change on flooding and so on is, and how we've got to mitigate against that in the future. But there's nothing about how we mitigate against this massive loss of biodiversity that we're facing at the moment, and maybe we need to be asking them to be a bit more sort of thinking about that kind of thing. So that's very quick. Sorry for the run through. Sorry for also keep dropping out with my connection with this windy weather. Okay, thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you, Claire. Okay, so it's now time for us to go into our breakout rooms, and you'll be put into one of the 4 themes, which some of you should have chosen beforehand. This is just a chance for you to have a chat, to share information, to raise awareness of some of the different issues, to stimulate your thinking really about how MPF4 works and how you can get involved yourself and engaged. And it also will give us an idea of the areas which will be most of interest to you in future for our topics of meetings. So we'll be coming back together again at about 5 to 8. So have a good chat, everyone, and see you in a little while.
So this was a whistle-stop tour. We will be, as I said, running more events with specific look at different policies, different topics, such as housing, such as sustainable development, or whatever. So please do keep in touch with us. We will send some template forms to explain how we are going to respond to the document, which might be worth you guys supporting if you feel that we're aligned with your thinking, and we will continue to write blogs and send you more information and have further opportunities to discuss perhaps in more depth than we have tonight around the policies. Hopefully next year we might even be able to meet face to face and do some workshops. We've already got 2 workshops lined up with some smaller groups, which might be a little bit more manageable. Kelly's just put into the chat some of the addresses that you can get in touch with the National Planning Framework team and to look at the National Planning Framework itself. So I hope that was a useful event for you all. And also a little bit of a celebration of the last year of planning democracy and what we have been doing, which is working tremendously hard with you guys to get a fairer, more inclusive planning system in Scotland. Anything more to add, Helen?
So no, not at all. I think that's it. Thank you very much, Claire. And that's all. I think we will, as I say, we will be sharing all the information. So all the links, everything, if you haven't managed to scribble it all down from the chat, everything will be shared shortly. So thank you all very much indeed for your contributions. And
I think the
thanks.
final comment should be a happy Christmas to all our readers, if he used to say.
Thanks for the reminder.
Thank you for that. Happy Christmas.
Yes, happy Christmas, everyone.
Happy reading.
Yes.
Happy reading. Yeah.